there is a dinner that stopped happening. You know the one that I'm talking about. No explosion, no single movement, just a slow cooling. A conversation that went somewhere uncomfortable, a silence that grew on its own gravity, and then, one final day, two separate worlds where it used to be one. Most people actually think that this is some kind of personal failure. It isn't. It is one of the oldest pattern in human history playing out at the smallest scale possible. Every empire that ever collapsed, every religion that ever launched a crusade, every nation that ever decided its neighbors had become an existential threat actually started here at the exact same point, with two people who used to share something and then suddenly didn't. The Greeks called the Persians barbarians. The word literally meant people who make incomprehensible sounds. The Persians as well, they had a word for the Greeks. It meant the same thing but in a completely different language. Two civilizations, right? Each one of the most sophisticated thing their world had ever produced. Each absolutely certain that the other was in the negation of everything that the civilization actually meant. They were not wrong about each other, and I'm not trying to explain some kind of a paradox. I'm trying to unfold the exact same pattern that unfolded years ago, because this video is not about why civilizations actually clash. That question is actually too easy. It's about why they always clash the same way, and why the same way is happening right now as I speak in your life in ways you probably haven't even named yet. The Reformation split Christianity in 1517 over disagreements so specific that most people who are actually alive today cannot name them without actually looking them up. What this obscures is actually the number, and it's absolutely scary. Christians in 1517 agreed on approximately 95% of their doctrine, which included a variety of aspects and attributes, right? Like the God, the Christ, and the recuration. The entire architecture of 15 centuries of faith that had actually held to common for so many years. However, what they disagreed on was just the remaining 5%, and they burnt each other alive for it, and for about 130 years. The 130 years of war killed a third of the population of Central Europe, not over whether God actually existed, over the precise mechanism by which God saves a soul. Here is what that tells you about human beings. The closer the belief, the more dangerous the disagreement. It was not the 95% that made them enemies, it was actually the 5%, because the 5% was the part that felt like their own identity, the part that if they actually surrendered meant that they actually surrendered themselves, and that feeling for them was absolutely dangerous. Both sides actually used identical methods. Each burned the other side's book. Each called the other agents devil. Each appealed to the same God to authorize the same atrocities that they had been committing over the past couple of years. The mirror was absolutely perfect, and the fundamental problem here is that neither side could actually see it clearly without having their personal opinions masked, right? The groups that clash the most violently are never the most different, they are the most similar. Similar enough that the difference feels like some kind of betrayal. In 1947, the British drew a line through India. They called it a partition. They drew it in about 6 weeks. Lord Mountbatten's lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, had never actually been to India before he actually executed this particular assignment. He drew the line through maps in an office in the summer in the heat with a strict deadline from his subordinates. Up to 2 million people died in the months that actually followed. Between 12 and 17 million people were actually displaced and moved from their places. Nobody agrees on the exact number because the record kept getting collapsed along with everything else that was actually recorded as evidence. And here is the thing that history almost always skips. Most of the killings were not done by soldiers, it was done by neighbors. People who had shared markets, marriages, monsoons, and meals for generations, killing each other with tools from their own farm. What fundamentally changed here was not the people, it was just the category. Because before partition, a Punjabi Muslim and a Punjabi Hindu shared a language, a landscape, a cuisine, a sense of humor, a particular way of arguing at the market. After the partition, however, they shared a border, and a border does not actually describe the difference here. It manufactures a fundamentally strong difference for them to fight over. Both communities continued committing identical atrocities within weeks that actually followed after this development. The same methods, the same targets, the same stories afterwards, in which each side was the victim responding to what the other side had actually stated. Both stories were supported by evidence. Neither story was actually the point. Draw a line between two groups of people and you don't reveal a difference that was always there. You create a new one, probably a one that wasn't existing in the first place. In 100 days in 1994, approximately 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda. The killing was not done by an army, right? It was done by neighbors. The distinction between Hutu and Tutsis was not ancient. Belgian colonizers formalized it in 1930s, issuing identity cards, applying physical measurements, drawing a biological line where there had been a social gradient. Before the cards, the categories were fluid. People moved between them. After the cards, they were permanent, inherited, and official. By 1994, the categories had existed for about 60 years. They felt like they had always existed. What converted neighbors into killers was just one single word. Radio Millis Collins, a radio station that broadcasted across those same hills, actually spent months calling Tutsis Inyezi cockroaches. The word is the entire mechanism. You cannot kill a person the way you actually kill a cockroach. The killing requires a prior operation, the conversation of a person into a category, the category into a symbol, and the symbol into something that justifies what is about to follow next. The radio did not report on hatred that already existed. It manufactured the hatred it then went on to report, and it brilliantly worked. And in 100 days, with radio equipment that would have been obsolete in any American newsroom, here is what happens when you scale that operation with modern infrastructure. The fastest path from neighbor to monster is not actually hatred. It is the language, one word repeated until the person in front of you stops being a person. Coming to the Cold War, right? The Cold War was not a war about communism versus capitalism. That was the language. The language was not the thing that was actually disrupting or causing the problem. America's founding story was about the individual who could not be erased by the state. That rights be erased by the states, right? That rights preceded government, that power actually flows up. The Soviet Union founding story was about the people who could no longer be exploited by the few. That history moves towards justice. That was actually trying to convey that the past was not a crime and the future could be a correction. Both stories were absolutely sincere, and both stories were in certain lights and certain angles absolutely accurate, and both made the other's existence feel like an existential refutation. When Germany actually surrounded in 1945, the shared enemies disappeared. Two enormous enemies were suddenly on the same continent with no agreement with regards to what is going to come next. The alliance between America and the Soviet Union had lasted exactly as long as the threat it actually required it to last, right? Within 3 years, the Berlin blockade, the alliance was over before the peace was actually over. The CIA and the KGB ran operations so structurally similar that defectors from one side could be redeployed by the other with just minimal retraining. The same methods, the same logic of acceptable casualties, the same capacity, the same consistency, right? Documented on both sides to actually believe that the rules applying to the enemy simply did not apply to themselves. Look at how disappointing it is, right? Each side called the other's behavior evidence of fundamental evilism. Each side's behavior was so identical that nobody could actually tell them apart. And this is what we need to know, that every side in every conflict actually believes that it is the exception to its own accusations. This is not some kind of an hypocrisy, right? It is actually the architecture of how humans fundamentally justify survival, and this is a pattern that's been repeating throughout history. The dinner that stopped happening, one side withdrew because the values had diverged too far. Because you cannot share a meal with someone who believes that the sign is actually fundamentally true. The other side believes that the same thing, but in completely opposite directions. Both sides are using the same mechanism that the Catholics and the Protestants used in 1517, that the Hindu and the Muslims used in 1947, that radio operators in Kigali used in 1994. The same ideology that the intelligence agencies in Washington and Moscow actually used for 40 years to keep both the countries aside and fighting a battle that shouldn't exist in the first place. The software does not know what century it actually is. It only knows us, them, and threat. Here is the thing underneath all of these things. It is not hatred. Hatred is only a symptom, and we have discussed this throughout in a lot of our videos. If you have watched few of our previous videos, it is not even poverty, right? Scarcity creates pressure, but it doesn't explain why the split always follows some kind of identical lines rather than some kind of interest lines and fundamentally different strategies that should unfold in every conflict, right? People who cooperate perfectly under material stress will stop cooperating entirely the moment the categories harden. The root is actually this: identity requires a boundary, and every boundary actually requires an outside. You cannot know who you are without knowing who you are not, right? This is not a design flaw in human psychology. It is just the design evolution. It fundamentally did not produce creatures who could survive without belonging to a group. For about 100,000 years, the vast majority of human existence, the group was the survival, right? We've always circled up to this one fundamental value, and not metaphorically, literally, no group meant no food, right? And no group also meant that there was no protection, there was no reproduction, and belonging was the precondition for everything else. The group only existed because something exists outside of it. Remove the outside and the group dissolves almost immediately, which fundamentally means identity goes on to dissolve, which means at the deepest level of primate neurology, you die. The brain does not distinguish between a threat to your body and a threat to your group's identity. When somebody actually challenges what you fundamentally are, the amygdala responds identically to how it would actually respond to a physical attack. The stress hormones are actually the same. The speed from threat perception to defensive response is the same. The body does not fundamentally know the difference between a spear and a question about your own policies and politics. Defending your group's identity feels like fundamental survival for most people, and their identity is actually tied to it because it's been like this for about 100,000 years, and it's always been like that throughout 100,000 years because the question was always about survival, right? And the feeling is actually so accurate. The context has just changed with the modern century, right? The feeling hasn't received the update. It's just the way we see things have just gotten a little more better. And here is the game theory underneath the psychology that I'm trying to decode. Even when cooperation would make everyone richer, safer, and more successful, even when both sides can clearly see the math, conflict remains the rational choice under one's condition. When you cannot verify the other's intentions clearly, and even if you go to verify the intentions, it just goes against your belief system, and for some reason you do not want to buy that. And that's the reason why so many of us have been kept divided and keep debating on the same topics that does not make any sense every single day. This is also called as the prisoner's dilemma, right? The tragedy is not that people choose wrong. The tragedy is that under genuine uncertainty, conflict is the only logical choice. Every civilization that has ever gone to war was playing a game where the rules were made and it fundamentally turned the entire world rational, right? They were not at all irrational. They were trapped. And underneath the game theory is something deeper still. The group doesn't just provide safety, it provides the answers to the question every human being wakes up to every single day. And they want the answer to this question, and sometimes they just survive so they could get answers to this question, which is, why does any of this matter? And we're exactly talking about the phenomena of existential crisis. The group gives life a story. A story needs some stakes, and stakes require some kind of opposition, which keep the whole cycle running. And it's exactly working right now as I make this video and as I'm talking. An enemy is not a failure of the moral immigration. An enemy is actually a narrative necessity. This is why peace is so structurally harder than war is, and that's the reason why we see wars continuing longer than they actually should. War has a story. Peace is just the absence of one. And this is the fundamental learning that all of us have to walk away with, or a question that we have to challenge after we watch this video, which is that humans do not clash despite their psychology, right? They clash because of it. The architecture that makes love, loyalty and civilization possible is the same bloody architecture that makes the boundary between us and them feel identical to the boundary between survival and extinction. There is no switch off. There is only the awareness that the switch exists, and awareness is the hardest thing in the world to maintain when the software is already running. The moment the dinner stopped happening, it was not an argument. It was the moment one person looked at the other person and stopped seeing a person, and they saw a position or an ideology instead, a representative. The software had a trigger. The trigger got pulled, and everything that followed, the cooling, the silence, the empty chair, was not just emotion, it was logic that actually followed. Identical logic to every empire that ever looked at its neighbor and decided that its neighbor had actually become an existential threat. The scale was different, the core was fundamentally the same. It's just the battlefield changed and the software didn't. Before social media, manufacturing an output required time. Propaganda campaigns actually took years. The dehumanization had to be absorbed very slowly through repetition across a population that needed time to convert a neighborhood into threat. The algorithm actually removed the time constraint entirely. A recommendation algorithm carries no ideology. It has one objective: keep you on the platform and get you to spend as much time as possible. And what keeps you on the platform at scale across hundreds of millions of users every single day, ladies and gentlemen, is not some kind of information that you want to absorb. It is threat perception. Outrage keeps people engaged. Identity threat keeps people engaged. The feeling that your group is under attacks keep people present, reactive, returning. The algorithm learned this the same way it learned everything else, by watching what humans actually do and what they're actually building out of it. The algorithm did not invent tribalism. It built a factory that runs the software continuously at planetary scale without rest, optimized over billions of data points to figure out the exact stimulus that actually triggers the exact response to the exact person at the exact moment. Radio Miller's reached a few million people in a small country and took months to produce its effect. Facebook actually reached 3 billion people and can actually do it in a week. The raw materials is the same. Distrust that already exists. The output is the same. Threat perception manufactured on demand. The speed is the new height that we're actually talking about. The factories are now automated, and something is coming that is faster still. Systems that can generate at industrial scale the images and voices of testimonials of a group under attack, distributed to the people most likely to believe it before any verification infrastructure can fundamentally respond to it. The architecture remains unchanged. The amplifier has no ceiling at all. The dinner is not happening tonight, but the phone is, and the phone knows exactly which story to feed you, who you are, who they are. Why should you actually distance yourself, right? And it actually knows the exact same tactics to keep you on the platform for one more minute. One more minute, that's all it needs. Every war you've ever heard about actually started here. Not with armies, with a relationship that cooled, a silence that grew on its own gravity, one person who stopped seeing another person and started seeing a category, an ideological fight. The border between India and Pakistan was drawn first inside people's head, in the language they used for each other, in the questions that forced them to choose a side that had not required choosing before. The line on the map that just made official what the software had already accomplished. The Cold War was two dinner tables that stopped speaking to each other with nuclear weapons. The Reformation was a family argument about the correct interpretation of a shared belief that lasted 130 years and killed millions of people who actually agreed on 95% of things. Rwanda was a neighbor that received a broadcast right? None of it actually began with monsters. All of it began with people who were certain, absolutely rational, understandably certain that the other side had become something it was necessary to oppose. People running the same software are actually running in you through the algorithm right now, and you are not just watching them, right? You are actually a recipient of the code. The code does not know your name, your country, your politics, your faith. It knows one thing: us, them, threat. And it has known it for about 100,000 years, and it will keep you alive, and it is the reason why you're here, and it does not care what it actually costs to you. Knowing the code exists does not disable it. It only creates one thing: the possibility, small, fragile, easily lost, of watching it run without being taken away by it. So here is the question, ladies and gentlemen, not for the history, not for the civilization, but for you. The last time a relationship in your life cooled, the last time someone moved from a person to a representative of the other side in your mind, did you notice the moment it happened? Or had the software already taken you before you could fundamentally analyze what had actually happened without putting a filter on?